good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I am delighted to be sharing this conversation with three people who are extremely well equipped to talk about charting a course to new economy. And in fact, the cross-section of what these three do will make it for, I think, a pretty interesting conversation. We have with us remotely the Governor of the Bank of France, François Villeroy de Galhau. Governor, thank you very much for being with us this morning.
Thank you. And bonjour. As I am in Canada, I'm allowed to say bonjour et amitié depuis Paris.
Oui, bonjour. And to my immediate left, Mairead Lavery, who is the CEO of Export Development Canada, so in charge of facilitating and aiding businesses in their endeavor to grow and build their trade relationships. And to her left, or to her right, her left rather, is Rob Wesseling, who is the CEO of Cooperators, one of the largest multi-line insurance companies in Canada. So an industry, obviously, with a pretty keen eye on the risks ahead as well as the opportunities. Thank you all for being with us today. And I think by way of beginning and introducing yourselves and the theme, we will and are hearing a lot of talk about resilience. It is the word of our time. It means many different things, unfortunately, as often these words do. But I wanted to start with the notion of, when we think about a resilient economy, as it pertains to you and what you're doing, it will mean different things for each of you. I will start with you, Mairead. When we say resilience, what does it mean to EDC? What do you think it should mean to Canada?
So thanks, Amanda. Thank you for the invitation and to the forum. Delighted to be here. So when I think resilience, I just think of the definition of resilience and the need to quickly adapt to a changing situation. And that's what I see Canadian companies and Canadian exporters having to do today. So they have to be very resilient in our own economy, which is faced with climate crisis, which is faced with high inflation, high interest rates, a labour market which is really tight, and really struggling supply chains. So there's this need to actually, how do you overcome all of these crises at the same time? And then you throw that into the larger context of where our exporters are trading, and then you start to deal with geopolitics. Where can they trade safely? Where can they expect actually to have success around the world? What is the impact of the Russia-Ukraine situation? Where are the sectors that actually will be more resilient in the future? What does it look like? Is it existing traditional manufacturing? Does it look different? How do they adapt to technology? So this morning I was reading about polycrisis, and it really does feel like that. It feels like that internally, all these crises coming at our companies, and then exactly where do they invest? How do they pivot? And how do they handle this incredibly uncertain time? So resilience is how, in fact, they're going to do that. And without doubt, the one thing they have to do is get going. They absolutely have to reflect on some of these larger crises, including, if we just take climate as an example, many of Canadian companies, and we have a makeup of companies in Canada that includes a large number of small, medium-sized companies, and we have to get them going. The imperative is there today, whether it's physical risk, transition risk. Their customers are asking them to be part of the solution. So we have to help them in their supply chains, in their business, start to build more resiliency and start to really attack and address the trends that are coming at them. And unfortunately, when we've been in this low interest rate environment, this period of time when we could have been investing in technology to make us more productive or make our products more useful around the world, we haven't been. And now the crisis is facing us, we're really having to play catch up very quickly. So I think the message for me on resilience is the speed at which we need to help our companies actually deal with all these crises at the same time.
Thank you very much. A lot to chew on there. Rob, what does resilience mean to you in your industry and your business?
Yeah, Amanda, thank you. When I think about resilience, I tend to go to a United Nations Center for Disaster Risk Reduction model. And that model essentially says that when the bad thing happens, when the shock occurs, there's an element of absorption. So, how How effective is the system at absorbing the impact without creating negative impacts? There's a period of recovery, then hopefully there's a period of learning and planning and preparing for what comes next. And you know, our largest business is property and casualty insurance, so I'm going to go at this from the perspective of physical risk at this point at least. And what I'll share is that there are an important number, not a majority, but an important number of Canadian families and Canadian businesses actually that can't afford to insure themselves against the physical risks that they currently have. And that will only get worse. Even if we hit the Paris Accord targets, there is a certain amount of climate change that's locked into the system already. And so this is going to get worse over the next decades. It's not going to get better. But we do have the ability to plan and prepare for that by focusing on building infrastructure, putting our homes, businesses, and critical infrastructure in the right places, defending them effectively, so that we can absorb those events when they happen. And so I like to think about the berming project that was built in the 1950s to protect the city of Winnipeg. That's a great example of absorption. The floods still happen, they just don't impact the city. According to the city of Winnipeg, that berming project in today's dollars had a 40-to-1 payback just in 1997. So there's a good economic case for this activity as well. And so from an investment perspective, we have the opportunity to invest in Canada in a way that is going to be accretive to our economy. It is going to make us a safer society and allow us to be prepared for what we know is coming.
Thank you for that. And Governor, I'll come to you. I mean, one of the best models we have for resilience, of course, are what the world's central banks and banks did post-credit crisis. We understand what a buffer means and looks like, and they're working well today in this environment. What does resilience mean now in the context of where things stand?
Amanda, this is a question which is more complex than probably we could think. I'm just coming back, by the way, from Washington, D.C. and the IMF annual meetings, and we discussed it at length. I would say that from a macro standpoint, which is ours, resilience is probably a mix of stability and adaptation. You could think that these two words are opposite, but we should combine them. It's obviously price stability and financial stability. This is our primary responsibility, and it's part of resilience to give economic players confidence landmarks. If not, our long-term growth is obviously at risk. But it's also adaptation, adaptation to crisis, and unfortunately, we have an unprecedented accumulation of shocks at present, starting with this awful war in Ukraine and the energy crisis which it induces. But it's also adaptation to climate change or adaptation to digitalization. So we must give landmarks, and this is coming back to the inflation target of 2%, ensuring financial stability, but it does not mean conservatism. If I could put it this way, resilience is not statu quo. It's to have the best of stability and the best of adaptation. And this is what we discussed at length last week.
Thank you very much. And of course, also what became apparent and has been apparent, but certainly over the weekend at those meetings, is there is a rethinking perhaps or an acknowledgement of a change in how the world is organizing itself, if we can put it that way. What for decades was an assumption that globalization would continue and was positive and that trade would become freer and freer, we know has hit a pause. I think what we don't know is whether that's permanent, temporary, whether we should embrace it or fight it. It seemed to me, Governor, as though the rhetoric this weekend suggested an embracing of that rather than resisting it. In other words, adapting to perhaps a two-trade system, a reduced globalization. Do you see a threat from the fact that the world is more fragmented today than it was in 2019?
These are many difficult questions together, Amanda. I wouldn't say that we should embrace fragmentation, for instance. we should obviously be realistic. We have an awful war, unprecedented, at the borders of Europe. Russia should stop this war, by the way, and this would be the best economic remedy possible worldwide. Almost everybody agreed on that. So I cannot accept the idea that the present situation will last forever. It's a very unfortunate situation created by Russia's aggression. That said, we have to confront its cyclical consequences. Inflation is an obvious example. We, as central banks, said very clearly, and this was the IMF view, and this view was really shared by almost all participants, that we must normalize and, if necessary, tighten monetary policies in order to avoid the present inflation surge being entrenched. What part of it will be more than cyclical will be a structural change for what you call the new world or a new era. It's probably too early to tell, but to give some example, the rise of large emerging economies is a lasting change, and they are more and more powerful in the G20 and in our discussion, and it's welcome. To give you an obvious example, India will chair next year the G20, and they have an ambitious agenda, which is very welcome. Or climate change. We all said that there should be no contradiction between the short term, the energy crisis induced by Russian war in Ukraine, and the long term, which is a shift towards renewable energy and decarbonized energy. There could be for a while some greater use of oil or coal in some jurisdictions, but it can only be temporary. And if I take the European example, it's our obvious example to accelerate the shift to renewable energies and decarbonized energies. So it's probably very difficult in this situation to disentangle cyclical and short-term answers, which we cannot ignore, and long-term transformation. But I think it's really feasible, and this is why we are for.
And obviously, those are important points. Some of this, and we hope, obviously, the war in Ukraine does end, and it could end at any time, and we hope it does. Some of those issues that you were referring to, Mairead, in terms of supply chains, we are seeing this trend towards, we don't even call it onshoring, we call it friendshoring, which is a strange new friendly term for something that's really anti-trade in some ways. Is this something we need to be concerned about as an exporting nation, as a trading nation? Do we need to worry about that trend?
I don't know if we need to worry about it, Amanda, as much as we need to seize the opportunity. I mean, trade has continued, and of course, Canada is a trading nation. So when we look at our own situation and we look at Canada and we look at interest rates and we look at our own dollar, we look at what's happening in our economy, certainly the investors are looking at the Canadian economy now driven by housing and driven by domestic consumption. Trade is a way in which the Canadian economy will continue to grow and to be successful. So whether the term is friendshoring, we have to look at where Canadians can trade, and we have two problems. We have a problem with input of resources into Canada because we have a neighbour to the south which has an extremely strong dollar, and the inputs into the Canadian economy are becoming more and more expensive. And equally, we have some issues in Canada with actually getting our goods to market. Our infrastructure needs to be updated, but we need to actually get those goods to market to help our domestic economy. So I think what we might see is the importance of regional trade agreements becoming more discussed than globalization at large. But certainly the interest with which Canadians express vis-a-vis the European community, CPTPP, and what will be the growth engine in the future, I think we will still continue to see trade. And we have to remember Canadian companies that are embracing technology, that have the opportunities to help solve a global crisis like climate, will be needed in the future. So I still see the need for Canadian goods and services. Where they go might be slightly different, and I think we should encourage that because we have a large concentration to the south that we actually need to reduce to improve our economy.
Rob, are you seeing any of these issues showing up in your thinking around your business and how it affects, I mean, obviously it affects the Canadian economy deeply, but does it affect your business specifically?
It certainly does. The supply chain issues that we're discussing, they impact our ability to settle claims, to rebuild homes, to replace vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it actually comes back to the resilience question to a large extent. When we look at the supply chains that we're dependent on, it's clear to us that in many cases they've been optimized for the best case scenario or a very positive scenario, and they haven't taken into account the risks that we're currently experiencing. And so one of the approaches, one of the thoughts that we have is that we should optimize these supply chains with those risks clearly in mind, and that might cause us as an economy to focus on friendshoring, to focus on nearshoring, not as a statement of the relative merit of different nations or different economies, but simply as a risk mitigation tactic to ensure that we can absorb the shocks when they happen, and as a result of that, we'll be able to recover more quickly.
I do want to, Mairead, raise this, Governor, but certainly it's topical, and it was highly topical over the weekend and continues to be so, and that is the strong U.S. dollar and its impact on other economies. It doesn't sound from remarks the President has made that the U.S. is overly concerned about that impact. But other economies, especially emerging markets, developing economies, are very concerned with good reason. But as should we be. There are pros and cons of this for Canada. But where does that strong U.S. dollar play in the thinking of stability across the overall system?
May I first, Amanda, say a word about supply chains and what
Please.
Mairead and Robert said? It's not up to me to tell firms what kind of supply chains they should have. It's obviously their decision. But two very quick remarks. First, I speak from a region which is the most successful trade union worldwide, and this is the European Union and its single market. And we have built something which is a mix of free trade and common regulation, and which can perhaps inspire broader agreements or regions worldwide. And second, I am aware of this word friendshoring, but it has probably a strong political content. I think the word diversification of supply chains and having different providers is at least as useful, seen from my window. If I come back to your question about the exchange rate and the dollar, you know the rule of the game in the G20 and in the IMF, and we reaffirmed our commitment about that last week, that each of us, central banks, runs its monetary policy independently and focusing on domestic objectives, that is to say, price stability at home. We don't target exchange rate. And this is a way it has been working quite well for years. It doesn't mean that monetary policy are completely isolated, because the counterpart of this G20 commitment is that we have an in-depth dialogue to ensure what I could call mutual predictability of monetary policies. To put it in other words, we, the ECB or the Fed, incorporates in its own monetary policy decisions the spillovers coming from other countries or the spillovers it has towards other countries. And this was really a confident dialogue we had last week. So we did not discuss precisely about exchange rate. We discussed about monetary policies.
It is a factor of life for Canadian businesses and the Canadian economy, and there are winners and losers, as we know, from a strong U.S. dollar. Where is that on your radar of concerns at the moment that our dollar is hitting, it's only a 2-year low, but it does seem as though a strong US dollar is going to continue.
You know, Amanda, it's been a really interesting 2022 for exporters. They started the year and the dialogue was around labour shortage. And that was truly the number one issue for our exporters. It has absolutely morphed in the last 2 months to that of interest rates and where the Canadian interest rate will go. Of course, our exporters are interested in our dollar and whether that makes our Canadian goods cheaper when they sell them abroad. But I would say they're more interested in interest rates and issues like supply chains at the moment rather than the dollar itself. So, you know, very volatile, turbulent times. And I think the big question that it gives rise to is investment. Do they invest or not at this point in time? And that will be the really dulling effect of our current environment if we don't get the investment in, if we don't get it in now to make our companies more productive and actually help them to a transition to a different future. We're seeing some of our companies very strong, anything in the commodity base, any agriculture in particular replacing goods, but certainly our manufacturing environment struggling more, supply chain and the cost of inputs.
Let's talk about labor because it has been identified by business and government leaders as one of the biggest issues we now face. Rob, in your industry, how are you perceiving that and how big a challenge is it?
Yeah, certainly we've got about 6,300 staff from coast to coast to coast, and the highest number of vacancies that we've had in my history with the company, which spans 25 years now, and they tend to be very specific areas where it is challenging. You know, highly technical roles, whether they're in finance, whether they're in technology, whether they're in marketing, business intelligence, etc. And as a result of that, it's slowing our strategic progress down. And my understanding from my colleagues across the industry and across many industries is that that's a consistent trend.
I want to shift to what arguably one of the biggest challenges facing the globe. And when we think of a new economy, it's the one we all would have agreed was top of the agenda in 2019, and that is climate change and transitioning our economies there. Much more, in some ways, complex, and in other ways, perhaps there are new opportunities as we solve some of the problems we're talking about that can help us find shortcuts in this transition. Governor, it's a massive shift. It will transform our economies. I believe that there may be some structural cost in it. In other words, there may be some natural inflationary pressure from this transition, certainly front-loaded. Where is it in your thinking about that it's actually really interesting between stability and adaptation? That's exactly the equation that we would bring to this transition in front of us. How does that play out?
This is an absolutely key question. As you said, we have been active with this question for years now. We at the Banque de France created the so-called NGFS, Network for Greening the Financial System, in Paris, a bit less than 5 years ago. It was precisely December 17. We started with some pioneers, including the Central Bank of Canada, by the way. We were 8 at the start. We are now more than 110. So it's to tell you how serious this issue is for central banks and supervisors. That said, we should do everything what we can do. I will come back to that. But it must be clear that finance and central banks cannot do everything about climate change. We cannot replace sound public policies. We cannot replace probably a carbon price. And by the way, I pay tribute to the Canadian commitment of increasing the price of carbon. It's a very courageous and not obvious choice, but it will be efficient to diminish CO2 emissions. What can we do as central banks is to say very clearly that climate risks are part of long-term financial risk. It's what we do as supervisors. and to say to banks and insurance company, if you have assets, let's take the example of loans, which are in heavy carbonized industry or sectors, you have in the long run an additional risk, which is obvious. Doesn't mean that we prohibit it. Again, this is regulation. But it means that we have to assess, measure, and reduce this climate-related risk. It will probably be the same for monetary policy. We have corporate bonds in our balance sheet. We have collateral, where we take corporate securities as a guarantee for our refunding activities. When we assess the value of these corporate bonds, of this collateral, same thing. We must take into account the climate-related risk. And so we made decisive progress in the 5 past years. To give you an example, we were the first one in France 18 months ago, but it's now a European, in the European era, we developed climate stress test for banks and insurance companies. So rely on finance and on central banks to take each part of the green transition. Again, not doing everything, but taking its full part. Perhaps one last comment about what you said on inflation. Mm-hmm. It's very important to clarify one point. The present inflation surge does not have anything to do with climate change. Again, it's due to an energy shock, which is linked to the very strong COVID recovery and still more to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In the future, but it would be much more gradual, we could have what you call greenflation, if you take this obvious example of an increased carbon price, which is desirable. But it will be much more gradual, and we should incorporate it in our inflation forecast. Let me conclude with that. It's not a political commitment in any way. It's an economic necessity. If we don't incorporate climate change in our risk assessment, in our economic forecast, we will miss a very important element of economic reality. Mm-hmm. To put it in other words, whatever your stance on climate and energy transition, climate change is happening, will happen, and is having strong economic consequences. It would be a very significant mistake not to incorporate it in our forecast and in our operations.
In fact, we could argue that one of the important first steps in our path to pricing the costs, the risks of climate, began in 2015 when Mark Carney addressed the Lloyd's of London community at a gala dinner of all places, and began the process of insisting that risks be put on balance sheets. And so now we do have this way of measuring some of the risks, not all of them. You referred, Rob, to the uninsured risks, and I don't think you're including public assets, which of course is one of the massive uninsured risks that we face and have not priced in to our fiscal picture. But even on the private side, the insurance industry will lead the way, but it will rely on other regulations to force pricing mechanisms to force an agreement, at least, of how you're going to measure the risk. You can't do it independently, although you probably do quietly a lot independently that you don't talk about. How far are we? What's the gap between where we need to be on actually being adult about the risks we face and what we're talking about publicly?
Yeah, there's a number of questions in there, Amanda. I'm going to try and
that's my specialty.
I'm going to try and unpack that. So I'll start here. I think we do have the models and the capability globally, and much of that capability lies within the insurance industry. We should be the risk managers of the world. So we do have the ability to build the models that would tell us what things are likely to look like, not just next year, but 25 years from now, 50 years from now, and we need to continue to do that work. What is abundantly clear, even as that work is being developed, is that we've got this risk in the system already. As the governor indicated. And we've got an option in front of us. We're going to have a transition. There is no doubt that we are going to have a transition. The question is, what type of transition do we want? Do we want a planful transition that focuses on science, that tries to identify how the economy needs to change over a long period of time? Or do we want a disorderly transition? And a disorderly transition will have substantially more impact on those that are most vulnerable, because they are least capable of absorbing, least capable of recovering. And so, my call for my own industry is that we need to be the risk managers of the world. We need to step forward and share the knowledge, the capability, the capacity that we have, so that decision makers can make better choices about how to structure the economy, where to place their homes, businesses, and critical infrastructure, how to protect them. The insurance industry has a really substantial role to play if we're going to solve this problem in an orderly fashion.
Do you think that the emphasis will be on mitigation, or will it be on ultimately helping shape the decisions that change outcomes? In other words, if we properly price carbon or the cost of pollution or all of the other byproducts that we're talking about that cause climate change, we'll actually change the behavior up front. But we seem to be focused on mitigation.
Yeah, we need to do both. I would argue that 95, maybe 99 cents of every dollar that's focused on climate change currently is focused on mitigation, and I wouldn't take one penny away from doing that. That is the long-term solution to the challenge. We've got this risk that's built in, though, and it is going to get worse as we move towards hitting the Paris targets. And in fact, it will likely continue to get worse after that for a period of time. These are systems that you measure in decades and centuries, not in months and years. So we also have to adapt. And the little bit of magic about adaptation is that, on the whole, a dollar that we spend in adaptation, according to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, pays $2 to $6 back in terms of economic benefit, because we don't have the disaster that we have to recover from as a result of that. According to the UNDRR, it is 2 to 10 times. And so we should invest in adaptation. We should invest in resiliency in our communities, because it's actually going to build our economy. And I'll share just one anecdote. The Cooperators has just over 20% of its invested assets in verified impact investments. And according to Corporate Knights, that's the largest percentage of any financial institution in Canada, the largest of any insurer globally, which is something that we're really proud of. But it's not. We're doing it because it's the right thing to do, but that's not the only reason to do it. When I look at that set of investments that are producing green energy, creating educational opportunities, creating beds in long-term care homes, decarbonizing our built infrastructure, when I look at that set of investments over the pandemic period, over the volatility that we've had even in 2022, they've performed much better from a risk perspective than the rest of the investments in our portfolio. And so the message there is, doing this is actually good business. It's good for the economy. It's not just the right thing to do.
Can I jump in on this one? So I agree on the discussion on orderly versus disorderly. I actually think we're going to have both. We're not going to be able to get everyone to an orderly transition because many don't necessarily recognize it. So our objective has got to be, how do we move as many people as possible into an orderly transition? And I think this is a really important debate in Canada when you think of us as a natural resource-based economy. So there's a view that would suggest that we should be all in clean energy, in renewable energy. And certainly we need to move forward with renewable energy. And of course, having a lot of hydro energy in Canada, we're very fortunate. But we equally need to bring along our industries that need to transition as well. So we've got to find a way to help either smaller companies that don't recognize the impact of a disorderly transition, or our natural resource-based industries as well, whether that's mining, whether it's oil and gas. And particularly in this period of time when we're talking about energy security, there's a short, medium, and long-term discussion to be had around how does Canada, as a natural resource-based economy, actually effectively transition its economy, which today 20% of our exports are linked to fossil fuels. So I think you cannot have a dialogue that takes either of the extremes. It's going to be really messy, and I think you've got to get in and try and encourage as many as possible. We just announced our sustainable bond framework, and I mention it because for the first time ever, we have added social bonds to our green bond platform with sustainable bonds to try, and transition bonds, to try and indicate we're going to need all of these sources of financing on all of these areas to ensure that we actually move the Canadian economy forward.
I want to move to one of the risks that is in some ways perennial, but feels particularly true at the moment. And Governor, I'll start with you on political risk. And obviously, as a central banker, you only have to look to the UK, where we're measuring political decisions by the length of a head of lettuce, to know that this is a turbulent time. But it's not a new thing that politics can interfere with, and I don't mean that in a negative way, that the desire politically can run contrary to regulatory efforts, to central bank efforts, whatever it is. Do you feel there's heightened risk in the world in that regard? And it's very true with climate change. And I guess what I would point to, as I add to the questions in this list, is the short-termism that we're very aware of in the corporate world, in the political world. It does run contrary to some of these long-term agenda items we have.
Oh, you are right. Obviously, there is at present an accumulation of shocks and risk, which is unprecedented for most of us, even when we have decades of professional practice, which is my case. We should keep our compass. I mentioned price stability and financial stability for central banks, and we should keep these compasses in the long run. You are right. I sometimes say that central banks are independent not only of political interference, not only of private interests, but also of short-termism. Which is some disease of our century, or increased disease of this century. And so our task is to make compatible or convergence the cyclical challenges, I mentioned inflation fighting, and the long-term transformations such as climate change or digitalization. I think we can. And perhaps allow me about what you call political risks, perhaps to make the difference between geopolitical threats type Russian invasion. Frankly, they play a very strong role and they are very unwelcome. Mm-hmm. But you have also political debate in all our democracies, which is part of the game. Unfortunately so. We live in Canada, in Europe, in the US, in many countries. We live in democracies. It means that there can be discussions, there can be changes, and we can bring our technical expertise in this debate, but we have to respect the political outcome. If I take the example of Brexit, it was a result of a democratic process. We regret it as Europeans. I don't know if the British citizens do regret it at present, but we have to respect it. And so I would make really a difference between democratic debates within our countries and geopolitical threats worldwide.
Fair enough, and an important distinction. And obviously, the geopolitical is a little bit harder to predict or control, although the democratic political reality can also be difficult. Do you see a different risk in the short-term thinking of politics today than ever, or is it just as it's always been?
No, I think it's just as it's always been. I mean, EDC was set up in 1944. Second World War institution, part of Bretton Woods. So, to deal with Reconstruction post-World War II. So, we've been at this 78 years. We see geopolitics, we see political disturbances, as the governor said, play out in lots of markets around the world all the time. I think the difference with Russia, Ukraine, was the size of it, was the impact on food security, and was the speed at which it happened versus Brexit, for example, which was discussed for a long period of time. And that's the one thing that companies want, is some level of certainty for a period in the future. So when you can see it, you can plan for it. When it's a sudden shock, then you can't plan, and everything is much more challenging and is disarray. So I think it's same as with perhaps a sudden shock that has come into the system.
Short-termism is it's a massive problem for us, for our economy, for our society. Amanda, you started off by talking about Mark Coney, right? It's the tragedy of the horizon. The risk is just a little bit too far away, and so we don't deal with it. From a practical perspective, I'll share two thoughts. One is we can choose to measure success differently, and we can choose to measure success over the long term. I work for an organization that was founded by a group of farmers, social pioneers, credit union leaders, who said, we want to enable a financial security in our communities, not just now, not just tomorrow, but for the next, well, it's been 77 years. And I'll share with you that I have as many conversations with my board about how we will be relevant and compelling 20 years from now as I do about next quarter's results. That's a choice. So our leadership, our governance makes that decision. And then a second very quick practical example, and this is back to the investment side again. We've set a target that we will have 60% of our invested assets in resiliency investments, impact investments, or transition investments by 2030. And the transition investments, that target actually creates a long-term view, because we're not going to invest in organizations that haven't committed to net zero, that haven't developed a plan to get there, that haven't created interim targets, and who, when they come up, aren't meeting them. And so, the political atmosphere isn't going to change that all that much, because as an investor, we're going to invest in the economy that is actually going to drive us towards net zero and the Paris Accord. These are choices that we can make at a really practical level.
We don't have a lot of time.
May I add one thing, Amanda?
Please, yes.
Just following what Rob just said, and which I like very much, to take the long view. To give a practical example, I mentioned earlier climate stress tests. This is a way to look forward for banks, insurance, and the regulators. And in the climate stress tests we developed in Europe and in France, we took climate scenarios for 2050. Mm-hmm. So we obliged financial institutions to look forward and to take this long view. Yeah. This did not exist some years ago. I think it's a very useful instrument.
So that I stay on time, you've got 30 seconds each for this last one. It's a lightning round. But Philippe Jetté referred to the need for optimism at a time like this. And I think it is important that while there's so much complexity, there's crisis, we do remain optimistic. So Governor, I'll begin with you. What are you optimistic about?
In 30 seconds, I'm always a bit cautious about this word optimistic or pessimistic. It refers to personal psychology. I prefer the word confidence and the word hope. It's our job to inspire confidence, even in troubling times. This is why I insisted so much on the price stability and financial stability anchors. Believe me, we will deliver. Hope depends perhaps more on innovation and of the endeavors from private firms. When I look at my kids or even at my grandchildren, I'm still very impressed by the degree of awareness they have in climate change, in purpose, in digitalization. This is my best reason for hope. 30 seconds.
Well done. Thank you. Mairead?
So I'm optimistic. In any disruption, there's always winners, losers, opportunities, and challenges. I think Canada has a lot of great things going for it, including its natural resource, its industries in agriculture, in technology, in clean technology in particular. I think we have solutions that the world needs to solve climate crisis.
Rob, when I'm on a plane and the turbulence is bad, I look at the staff on the plane to see how they look. We should look to the insurance industry to see how confident we should be feeling. How are you feeling?
Yeah, so I'm going to be optimistic. There's a rough road ahead of us, there's no doubt. However, the economic case, the social case for climate change mitigation, for adaptation, it is solid. And so our economy will be better, our society will be better, our businesses will be better, our families will be safer if we take this path. And I think for the first time, as a global society, we're starting to be able to connect those dots. And so that makes me hopeful.
Thank you all for being with us for this. Please join me in a warm thank you and welcome to Governor Villeroy, Rob Wesseling, Mairead Lavery. Thank you all.